G'day, welcome to Navadia. Before I start, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has just subscribed. I really appreciate and honestly, welcome. Today I'm going to talk about a group who is the Australian equivalent of Prague University. You know, horrible anti-science take, hypocrisy, anti-GSM, anti-cancel culture, while vilifying everyone who doesn't agree with them, a persecution complex the size of their heads, which is approximately the size of a planet, and the sewage system to go with it. I mean, you could argue that I'm poisoning the well here, but I think you would agree that after this video, I'm only adding a little bit of cyanide to a well absolutely chockers full of botulism toxin after watching this. There is a reason why I haven't gone after them before, which is that I kind of like not having a stroke. They're a Christian lobby group that works in a very similar way the Christian right lobby does in the US. They have successfully lobbied against Safe Schools program, which is an anti-bullying program that teaches kids about LGBTQIA+ issues. They also fight against abortion, euthanasia, surrogacy, same-sex marriage, adoption by the GSM community, halal certification, gambling, prostitution, and an introduction of a Charter of Rights by the Commonwealth Government. Which is really hypocritical because, as I mentioned before, they're all about anti-cancel culture, yet they are against prostitution. Their Wikipedia page is a steaming pile of propaganda. It makes them look like they're all nice and not at all toxic group that has done wonderful things for society. It also makes them look like that they've been targeted by those mean, woke, terrible people. Oh God. Their Wikipedia page is extremely misleading, and if you want a better idea of their policies, I suggest going to their actual page. They have a YouTube channel which is presented by Martin Isles, an attractive, well-presented, charismatic, and highly educated guy that has one of those faces. You'll see what I mean. In one of their latest videos, he talks about three things: a lawsuit a climate change denier Peter Ridd has against his university, James Cook University, conversion therapy, and vilification laws. I was very tempted to do a video on Peter Ridd, but the conversion therapy one was way too hard to pass up. I'm going to get a climate scientist to come onto my channel and we can talk about the story with Peter Ridd. When it comes up, I'll link it in the description below. But let's talk about conversion therapy. This section goes for about 13 minutes, so I'm going to speed it up for time's sake and to preserve our sanity. But of course, I will link it in the description below in all of its glory.
All right, second up, I'm going to talk about LGBT conversion therapy. I have talked about this once before, but there's been a development. I want to comment on it, and I also want to express some developed thoughts on the issue. But last week, news surfaced that South Australia is the latest state where politicians are signalling that they may ban LGBT conversion therapy.
Good. This is considered to be torture, and it should be banned. Study after study after study after study after study has shown that homosexuality and gender identity is innate. Scientists don't exactly know what causes these, but it could be a combination of environmental and genetic factors. However, regardless of the cause, it has been shown that people don't choose to be gay, ace, hetero, or trans. Therefore, forcing someone through conversion therapy, which is usually predicated on negative reinforcement, is extremely damaging for someone.
They follow the lead of Queensland, Victoria, the Australian Capital Territory. None of those jurisdictions have actually implemented their full suite of laws yet, although Victoria and the ACT seem quite close. The ACT is forging ahead, actually, under cover of the coronavirus pandemic.
What, you expect Parliament should stop doing their job because there's a pandemic? You'd be surprised at how many laws get passed that we just don't know about. Right now, there's a law in the books in Australia that will, according to Google, greatly suppress the reach of YouTube channels such as myself. I haven't heard anything about this on the national media, and I only know about it because YouTube has been giving me pop-ups. Links below. Although, need I remind you that John Howard changed the marriage laws to exclude same-sex couples without much fanfare in the media? I mean, I was a kid at the time and I don't remember it, so I could be totally wrong, but apparently in the GSM community, it was a massive thing. And you can see why.
The Shadow Human Services Minister in South Australia, Nat Cook, has flagged that she is drafting legislation. The Greens have confirmed their support. Attorney General Vicky Chapman says that she has already considered a ban as a new criminal offence. And Cook says that the legislation will be introduced to Parliament, quote, as soon as possible, and that the penalty could be in the order of 8 years imprisonment.
I find this bit difficult to argue against. Torture should be a jailable offence. That's a hot take, I suppose?
Now, all of this activity to ban conversion therapy was precipitated by a report originally from the Human Rights Law Centre and La Trobe University, factory of all things ideological on this stuff, La Trobe Uni, and it was titled Preventing Harm, Promoting Justice, Responding to LGBT Conversion Therapy.
Notice quick jab at La Trobe University. Factory of all things ideological. Ideological. Ideological, I can never say that word. His entire lobby is ideologically based. Well, now I can say that word. But even so, what is wrong with the ideology of let's not be assholes to people?
And this is some of the things that the report says. It says that harmful, and that's a quote, conversion practices emerged in conservative Christian communities in the 1970s. It further claims that, quote, rather than receding, our research suggests that conversion practices and ideologies are being mainstreamed within particular Christian churches. Conversion activities can constitute torture or cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, particularly when they are administered through force to children. Now, let me be very clear on this. Through force or to children. Slight correction there. But let me be very clear about this, and as clear as I can possibly be. The situation with this conversion therapy stuff and the narrative around it, and particularly what is said there at the end about torture and cruel and inhuman degradation and all the rest of it, and emerging more and more, not receding in the modern church, this is a lie. This is a sham. This is an anti-Christian dog whistle. It's a smear campaign. It is not true.
And that's where the persecution complex appears. In October 2018, a hack investigation by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, or the ABC, reported on conversion therapy in Australia. Alongside the Human Rights Law Centre, Gay and Lesbian Health at Victoria, and La Trobe University, they did, indeed, find there was an increase of conversion therapy in Australia. Some could argue that there is an increase of reporting rather than an increase of actual therapy, but the fact is, it's still here. Also, I'm sorry to make the genetic fallacy here, but I'd rather trust research done by 3 highly respected institutions than an unsighted claim made by a right-wing Christian lobby that actively works against people who identify as GRSM.
There is no conversion therapy under that definition in Australia today. Indeed, the South Australian Attorney-General admitted in the same breath that there was, quote, no evidence that practice exists in South Australia today. Oh, and yet they'll ban it.
Yes. Have you never heard of prevention?
Let me break this down just for a second. First of all, let's look at the phrase conversion therapy. It's totally unknown to any religion.
Except for the fact that it is used by religious people?
Those are not the words of Christians, who are singled out by the report time and again.
Yes, it could be because Christianity is the major religion in Australia. Therefore, it makes sense that it is concentrated on.
Those are the words of activists who have invented those words, accused people of faith with them, and left everyone scratching their heads. We've never heard of the phrase.
Are you just willfully ignorant? That takes a lot of effort to never hear that phrase. Even if it wasn't used, the fact remains that there are people saying that they can stop someone from being homosexual or trans that still exist. A pile of dog shit by any other name.
Sure, someone can be converted. That is true. That's called salvation.
No, they can't. Gender identity and sexual orientation cannot be changed. Science is very clear on this.
Right? Sure, someone can go and get therapy someplace. That's called medical treatment. The two don't actually have anything in common.
Note the implication here that homosexuality or being trans or gender non-conforming is a disease.
God converts, people do therapy. They're unrelated concepts. Second of all, to the extent that, as they say, torture and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment has been applied to people due to their sexuality, that was never just a church thing. Now fine, if that's what they're banning, ban away. Go for it. No problem, because it isn't happening and nobody wants to do it. But it was never just a church thing.
It actually is. The vast majority of the cases where someone was subjected to conversion therapy was under a religious setting. I have never heard of a secular group of people advertising or performing conversion therapy. I'm not saying they're not out there, but I'm also saying they're in the vast majority, even if they do exist. And if you scratch beneath the surface, you'd probably find religious influence there.
In a bygone era, coercion and these horrible things you see, for example, there's that Hollywood movie that's very strategically timed, Boy Erased, about the boot camp.
I kind of have a feeling that he'd say Boy Erased is strategically timed no matter when the movie was released. This movie is to show the horrendous experience that gay, lesbian, trans and gender non-conforming people undergo due to conversion therapy. I'm sorry that upsets your sensibilities.
There's electric shock therapy, things like this. Yeah, cruel, inhuman, degrading. Those things, they happen from time to time across the board, including in the medical profession, including in some government-run institutions. Right?
Hooray, whataboutism! Woo! What used to be known as electric shock therapy is being looked into as a genuine treatment for things such as PTSD, depression, and other psychological disorders. It has changed from the brute force just zap someone in the head from decades ago. It is now known as electroconvulsive therapy, which passes a carefully controlled electric current through the brain, which affects the brain's activity and aims to relieve severe depressive and psychotic symptoms. It is used as a last resort for fast treatment for life-threatening symptoms. These people undergo extensive psychological examination beforehand. It is done under informed consent. The patient is put under general anesthetic and given a muscle relaxant. Electrodes are placed on the skull and the current is passed through the brain until a brief generalized seizure occurs. Because this person is under anesthetic and they have had muscle relaxants, they do not experience any pain. Comparing the highly effective and scientifically based electroconvulsive therapy to the brutal electroshock treatment that people undergo in conversion therapy is like comparing someone undergoing a lobotomy for psychological disorders to someone undergoing a lobectomy to remove a brain tumour.
But politicians are being scammed with this. They're being hoodwinked into supporting laws on the basis that they will outlaw a practice which isn't happening. They're told that they will outlaw torture.
While on the surface, female genital mutilation isn't happening in Australia, it's still illegal here, just in case it happens. Because, let's be honest, somewhere, right now, there are girls in Australia at risk of FGM, and some have undergone that process on Australian soil. These girls shouldn't have to wait for a law to be changed so they can get justice. It's already there. That's the point of this law. That's the point of any law.
Under a label, conversion therapy, which isn't used by Christians because it doesn't make theological sense and it doesn't make scientific sense. The report itself admits that there's no evidence of so-called conversion therapy practices in Australia today. But if you can believe it, it nonetheless surmises this. It says 10%. It says this: because 10% of Australians are active Protestants, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, or Muslims, mostly Protestants, they are actively involved, therefore, in a religion that may potentially promote, quote, may potentially promote conversion therapy. And on that basis, and that basis only, the report then claims that up to 10% of Australians may be vulnerable to conversion therapy ideology and practice, and, quote, up to 10% of LGBT Australians are vulnerable to harmful conversion therapy practices. Basically an assumption. But how is that possible?
Could it be that 10% of people in Australia are religious?
Well, the devil's in the detail. Note that the activists who wrote the report classify the following as conversion therapy. So they start with all this talk of torture and degradation and so on. And everyone goes, well, amen, get rid of it. Great, no one wants to do that.
Make note again of the derogatory way he talks about activism. Again, hypocrisy at its finest, as he is part of a lobby group. Because Australian Christian lobby group, activism, kind of the same thing.
Aha. But then they start saying, but this is everywhere in Christian communities. And you go, well, I don't know about that. But then all of a sudden you find they've done a bait and switch. When they say conversion therapy, after a while, they're no longer talking about what they were talking about at the start. Let me tell you some examples from the report that they refer to as dangerous conversion therapy or conversion therapy ideology. First, churches that state, quote, change is possible. Well, that would be every church. Churches that have a, quote, welcoming but not affirming stance. Church communities that are, quote, saturated with an exclusively heterosexual ideology. Like, as in what the Bible says about sexuality.
And this is where you don't understand that words can be harmful. If you're a religious person who is also GRSM, you have to decide between your biology or your faith. This causes a huge amount of conflict within a person if their church is not affirming of the GRSM community.
The idea that same-sex attracted people are committed to living celibate lives. Right.
Well, how else are they going to be both religious and queer in a church that basically tells them that they are disgusting human beings because of their orientations? They can't have sex with the person they fell in love with because that's a sin. It's either lie to themselves, their partners, their family, and their friends, or just not have sex. It is an impossible bind where you, a presumably straight man, will never understand.
Activities in faith-based settings between freely consenting adults. So this is the idea that if freely consenting adults want to talk to each other about living out their sexuality in light of their faith, that's somehow dangerous conversion therapy ideology.
To be honest, I wonder if this has been quote mined. He doesn't cite the source he's reading from, so I can't exactly say where he got it from. I looked at the Preventing Harm Promoting Justice report done by the Human Rights Law Centre, and it wasn't in the PDF. I also looked at the La Trobe University report and still couldn't find it. So, Martin, where is this? What are you quoting? Hi, it's Editing Navadia here. It actually seems like Martin misread, but that doesn't actually mean much at all, because, of course, it was absolutely quote mined. In the report, under the heading The Importance of Autonomy, the quote in full says, "However, this must be counterbalanced with respect for freedom of religion and the personal autonomy of adults who wish to seek out conversion practices. Governments have a somewhat inconsistent approach to regulating access to goods and services which carry known health risks, but to take a similar approach to the regulation of tobacco, alcohol, and products high in processed sugar would suggest that adults should be freely able to choose to engage in conversion practices."
Scripture reading, it says. Prayer, it says. I see. Now we see what's going on, just under the surface of this nasty stuff. What's happening in Australia today, see, is this. Firstly, Christians believe and teach that the life to which we are called is a life in which we refrain from sexual lusts of all kinds, regardless of our sexuality.
Purity culture. Look, it doesn't matter who you are or what your orientation is. Purity culture is damaging. People have come out of it with lifelong scars. Even though I lost my religious beliefs at 15, I was still getting guilt from a leftover purity culture years later. Add the guilt and shame of the homophobic and transphobic rhetoric displayed by the religious people such as the ACL, and you have the perfect storm for things like self-harm and suicide.
Not one of us gets to pursue or explore or the full length of our potential sexual desires, right? We live differently.
Well, you can pursue your sexual desires, but you also have to let go of the sexual repression from purity culture that is hammered into you from your childhood.
And Christians of all sexual desires seek totally voluntarily to live out that belief. Now, apparently that is harmful conversion therapy. Apparently that teaching in the pulpit must be stopped.
When you teach from the pulpit that your sexual and gender orientation is a sin, unnatural, dirty, and abhorrent, then yes, it should be stopped. Because it's harmful.
Secondly, what's happening in Australia, some adults who, of their own free will, want to talk about living out their sexuality in light of their faith, do so. Sometimes it's in groups, sometimes it's private, sometimes it's with a trusted friend, sometimes it's called counselling. Sometimes they give these groups names, sometimes they call them ministries. Now, apparently that is harmful conversion therapy.
Well, yes. Group counselling sessions can be used as a way to shame people. In the Heaven's Gate cult, they were expected to tell everyone their sexual fantasies and desires. If they had any form of sexual impulses, even wet dreams, they were shamed and ridiculed. In a group setting, if a person explained that they were still feeling homosexual urges, then they could very easily undergo group hazing rituals.
Freely consenting adults who want to live their sexuality as they please in light of their faith. So hang on, so now everyone's supposed to be free to live out their own sexuality without judgment, without blame, without hindrance. Oh, unless you're a Christian.
And here's the Christian persecution autofellatio again. Remind me how you, as a group who worked extremely hard against the same-sex marriage, the successful removal of the Safe Schools program, and lobbied to stop gay and lesbian people from adopting, is allowing people to be
free to live out their own sexuality without judgment, without blame, without hindrance.
How?
Right, okay. Well, at least we're clear. What else is happening in Australia? Parents teach their faith to their kids. They normally explain that, to use an LGBT word, heteronormativity, that is, that boys like girls and get married and have children, shock horror, is God's design, and they will normally wait and see if a child claims transgender or homosexual inclinations rather than rushing to affirmation.
By saying that, you're suggesting that heteronormativity is God's design, and therefore, if you aren't cis, you aren't part of God's design. For someone who is very religious, this can and does cause distress. Add the general background radiation of guilt that religion imposes on you, it's just that little bit of extra damage put onto you as a child being raised by religious parents.
Now, apparently that is harmful conversion therapy, even though it is not just the approach of parents of faith, but it is wise counsel. For example, we know that in the area of gender dysphoria, between 80 and 90% of children, if we adopt this wait-and-see approach, will revert back to the identity of their natal birth sex, right?
Citation please? I love that he makes claims but almost never cites them. Yes, there's a few times he has, but only when he's talking about the immediate article. And he never leaves links to them either. For example, he cites the La Trobe University study, but also conveniently forgets to add the two other research arms that contribute towards it. Because the Human Rights Law Centre is a little bit harder to attack than the university. Frankly, I'm surprised he didn't attack Gay and Lesbian Health Victoria, but it's associated with Access Health and Community. It's a large corporation that has government funding and has been operational since 1869, so they can't exactly say, it has no credentials. Not that that's ever stopped them. In regards to his 80 to 90% of children reverting back to their natal sex claim, this comes from a 1995 study by Zucker and Bradley that found that within a group of 45 gender non-conforming children, 80% were not transgender at follow-up, usually in the high school years, according to a Slate article. I was unable to get my filthy little hands on this study to read, but let's say the Slate is accurate in their reporting. By the way, this is a do what I say, not as I do thing. You should never rely on media reporting of a scientific study, and I am actually, frankly, a little bit ashamed of myself. A little bit of background information about these researchers, though. Bradley is a follower of Ray Blanchard, a person who thinks that all trans is a perversion. Blanchard is also the guy who coined the term autogynephilia, which is a hellhole that I won't go into. Links in the description, by the way. And Zucker is a proponent of conversion therapy. Now, let's talk about this study Martin mentions. First of all, the N value, or the number of participants, is incredibly small. The larger the N value, the less prone it is to statistical error. For example, if one child was trans in this study, the impact that they had on this percentage is 2.2%. However, if the child was in a group of, let's say, 300, the percentage impact would have been 0.3%. For 80% of the children to finish up as not being transgender in this group of 45, that meant 9 of them were trans. Going by the Slate article, these findings are used to argue that social transitions should not be encouraged because, according to the logic, around 80% of these children who are identified as gender dysphoric will not ultimately be transgender if left alone or given proper therapy. Here, again, the distinction between transgender children and the rest of the spectrum of gender non-conforming children is critical to acknowledge. The studies that found this 80% number or similar numbers included a broad range of gender non-conforming children. The authors of this particular study, Zucker and Bradley, wrote that it is actually quite rare for children who are brought to gender clinics to believe themselves to be the other gender. Much more common were children who showed cross-gender behaviours, who may have wished that they were gender at other times but still saw themselves as members of their original gender group. Thus, most of the children who are argued to have grown out of their gender dysphoria never claimed a transgender identity to begin with. The entire Slate article is very interesting, and I suggest you give it a read. Links below, unlike what you will find in Martin's video, because apparently I have intellectual integrity.
But no, parents cannot raise their children according to their faith. See, now we're getting the picture. Now we're getting the picture. It's this simple, it turns out. They just don't like what people of faith believe. They don't like the way that people of faith seek to live out those beliefs, and they want to make it criminal.
No, we want abusive and harmful behaviours towards GRSM kids to stop. You are absolutely 100% okay to take your kids to church and worship God. There is nothing in this to outlaw your Christian faith. You, on the other hand, want to make abortion illegal. You lobbied to keep it illegal in Queensland. It is now, thankfully, no longer in the criminal code. Your hypocrisy is incredible.
And that is a simple, bald-faced attack on people's basic freedoms masquerading as a movement against torture.
You tried to stop gay people from getting married. How is that not a simple, bold-faced attack on people's basic freedoms?
Right? We're all against torture, every single one of us, but that's not what this is about. As I said, it's a lie, it's a sham, it's an anti-Christian dog whistle, it's a hook to get politicians to undermine what is effectively the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, lest you think I'm overreacting on this.
Spoiler alert, you are.
So I've been engaging with the issue for a little while now, and one story stands out in my mind.
Ah, the good old anecdotal story about something an anonymous person said to you.
I was speaking to a politician that helped to draft the LGBT conversion therapy policy that the Labor Party had for a couple of years before 2018 when they removed it because of a campaign by ACL and others. And that policy clearly said that parents who did not exclusively affirm, that is not even wait and see, but did not exclusively affirm their child's chosen gender identity would be deemed domestic and psychological abusers.
Because it is abuse. Have you never talked to a person who has had non-affirming parents? Do you have any idea how much damage that causes? People have killed themselves over this. They've killed themselves because their family members didn't affirm this gender identity or sexual orientation. People have been thrown out onto the streets because they were gay or trans. This is abusive.
I think it's smuggled into the platform because of this politician and a couple of others who are quite radical.
I love the idea that not being an asshole is now considered to be quite radical.
And I asked her about this, and guess what her words were? She said, "What else are we supposed to do when parents take their children to the church?" You know something? I think that among the worst things that a parent could do to their child is raise them as an atheist.
Do I really need to say anything?
I find it tragic. I think it has temporal psychological impacts. I think it potentially has eternal well-being impacts on a child. And yet it has never occurred to me, never, not even so much as once, that such children should be removed from their parents, or that their parents should be deemed by the state to be psychological or domestic abusers. Why? The family is too important. The family is too important.
The difference between atheism and Christianity is that atheists don't give kids guilt, shame, sense of worthlessness, and a fear of eternal torture in the afterlife, which, believe me, is a hell of a lot less damaging than whatever branch of Christianity that you are in.
The report tells the story of 15 LGBT Australians, which seem to be the sum total of their Australian evidence.
No, it's 15 people who are willing to talk about their experiences. At least 15 people on Australian soil were psychologically tortured to pray the gay away. At least 15 people in Australia underwent ritual humiliation, guilt, and shame cycles. At least 15 people in Australia underwent Freudian analysis, where their parents were blamed for their homosexuality, for their sin. At least 15 people in Australia had irreparable harm done to them by a religious leader in the name of pseudo-scientific bullshit. And that is 15 people too fucking many.
All of these 15 Australians say that they've had experience with church or faith communities which taught abstinence and the possibility of change. Or not always church communities, I think there's a Buddhist and a Hindu as well. But the report does not say this. For every one of those LGBT Australians who say they did not like being part of a church and found the teachings of the Christian life hurtful, there is at least one who declares the opposite.
If your hit rate is 50% of GSM people who go to church who finds it harmful, then you actually have to admit that's pretty bad odds. If it was 33 or even 25% of religious LGBT people finding the Christian life harmful, that is too much. 25% is 1 in 4. If for every 4 people who are okay with Christian life, 1 is actively being harmed by it, then you have horrendous odds. If 1 in 4 people got hurt by a product, that company would be facing a lawsuit. Yet you're okay with 1 in 2?
I had dinner in Perth with a group of people who fit into this category.
Oh, more anonymous, unverifiable anecdotal evidence. Oh, goody.
They've become Christians and they've left their LGBTQ life behind them, and they say nothing has been more liberating. Now, that's their words, that's not mine. That is their words, their life, their experience.
Did you know that the people in the Heaven's Gate cult who also castrated themselves also thought the same? Just because they feel free, it doesn't mean they are.
There is a march for freedom in America.
Oh, because Australia is America now, apparently.
Where hundreds of people with this background march together to say there is freedom in Christ, this is who I am, this is my story, and this group that I was having dinner with in Perth, they told me that there are scores of others.
Considering the amount of times you twist facts to suit your narrative, how can we believe you? I mean, you haven't given us any other details other than there was a group of people in Perth. Sure. Okay. I, too, have had a dinner with a group of people in Perth. Only the difference between you and me is that I'm okay with telling you that I just lied, where we can't be sure that you have.
And I know that there are, in fact. I've met a lot of them. We see this march in America. And they said none of them are given a voice by modern media or politics, but all of them are so grateful for those with the courage to talk about this and to defend their conversions to Christ and the changes in their lives.
Oh, I know. It really takes a lot of bravery to come out and proclaim your Christian religion in a country that is... Wait, let me check. Oh yeah, Christian majority. This, again, is the Christian persecution autofellatio that they like to dole out while persecuting people who aren't Christian or conform to their Christian ideology.
Now let me say this, therefore, while this is still legal. Change is possible. Apparently that's dangerous conversion therapy ideology, according to the Human Rights Law Centre, which needs to be banned.
Oh, so now you mention the Human Rights Law Centre. Yes, conversion therapy ideology should be banned because it's harmful and isn't based on science. It is no different to banning someone from saying their essential oils cures cancers. They now have to say may cure cancer instead, which, in my opinion, is still not far enough.
But you know what? Change is possible. And it's just as well for every single one of us because that's the story of the Christian life. Every one of us is a living testimony of change.
And this is where he invents the disease and then sells you the cure. Homosexuality and transgender is wrong and sinful and icky, but if you come to Christ, you will be fine. He just prattles on about how wonderful Christianity is, how it can change your life, drops a few Bible verses, blah, 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 you get the point. He also says there are people who used to be LGBT. I genuinely hate this man. I would rather have a conversation with Paul and Morgan over him, just to give you an idea of how much I despise this person. Anyway, I apologise to you for putting you through that, but trust me, it was just as painful for you as it was for me. So thank you for making it through this, and don't forget, don't give yourself the raw prawn. I just want to say a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons, especially my $10 Platypus patrons, Ada Furball, Lauren Hart, Mary Civitano, Amanda Vogue, and Ross Devereux. I also have to say a very special thank you to my $20 Platypus patrons, Paul Butler and Ethan Stroop. Sorry you know about these people now, I apologise. And also again, thank you very much to everyone who has recently subscribed.